Welcome to Falcon Times. Tonight we're focusing on one of the most significant developments in the Russia-Ukraine war, U.S. President Donald Trump's meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy in Washington. Over the next half hour, we'll walk through what happened, what was promised, what was demanded, and what it all means for the future of this conflict and the world beyond it. The White House played host to a high-stakes gathering. President Zelenskyy arrived in Washington to meet with Trump, accompanied by a handful of European leaders determined to keep the West engaged in Ukraine's defense. Cameras captured the two men seated side by side in the Oval Office. Trump described their talks as good, productive, even constructive. Most importantly, he said the United States would play a role in providing security guarantees for Ukraine. That single phrase is already reshaping expectations. It suggests that, despite his earlier skepticism of foreign commitments, Trump is preparing to keep America firmly in the diplomatic center of this war. But the promise of guarantees came with conditions. Before any peace summit can happen, Trump made clear that Ukraine must drop two long-standing goals: the ambition to join NATO and the demand to regain Crimea. Both of these points cut deep. Since 2014, when Russian forces seized Crimea, Ukraine has insisted the peninsula must be returned. Most of the world has treated Russia's annexation as illegal. On NATO, Kyiv has argued that membership is its only reliable shield against future aggression. Abandoning these goals would not just be a tactical concession, it would represent a fundamental redrawing of Ukraine's national strategy. European officials are deeply uneasy. One diplomat put it bluntly: Trump is offering peace, but at a steep price, recognition of Russia's land grab and the closing of NATO's door. For Ukrainians, the situation is even more fraught. Zelenskyy built his presidency on the promise of resisting Moscow and tying Ukraine's future to the West. Already, protests have been reported in Kyiv's Maidan Square. Demonstrators are chanting "No compromise on NATO, no compromise on Crimea." The political cost at home for Zelenskyy could be enormous. To understand the context, we need to look back just a few days. In Alaska, Trump met with Vladimir Putin. The summit ended without a deal, but the images were striking: smiles, handshakes, compliments about each other's strength. For critics, it raised alarms that Trump was leaning closer to Moscow's position. For supporters, it was proof that he alone could bring Putin to the negotiating table. That meeting now looks less like an isolated encounter and more like the opening scene in a much larger diplomatic play, one that could bring Putin, Zelenskyy, and Trump together. For Trump himself, the stakes are high. His political base wants him to end what they call endless wars and reduce America's role abroad. But he also sees the chance to secure something no president before him has achieved: a Ukraine peace deal. If he can get Putin and Zelenskyy to shake hands under his watch, he could claim the mantle of peacemaker, a headline that would dominate his legacy and his re-election campaign. Global reactions have been mixed. NATO allies are nervous. If Ukraine is forced to drop its NATO aspirations, the credibility of the alliance itself could be undermined. Some leaders fear it might send a signal to Moscow that aggression works, that redrawing borders by force can eventually be legitimized. Meanwhile, China is watching with its own interests in mind. Beijing has maintained ties with Moscow throughout the war. A US-brokered settlement could limit China's leverage over Russia. India, which continues to buy Russian oil, has so far stayed quiet, preferring to keep its options open as it balances ties with Washington and Moscow. The road ahead is uncertain. Trump says preparations for a summit between Putin and Zelenskyy are already in motion. Officials suggest it could happen within the next 2 months, though no date is set. But the risks are enormous. If Zelenskyy refuses Trump's conditions, the talks may collapse before they even begin. If Putin refuses to compromise, Trump may walk away empty-handed. And even if all three men sit down at the same table, any agreement will face the same old problem: enforcement. History shows that promises made in Moscow are not always promises kept. For Ukraine, the question is whether survival is worth the price of concessions. For Trump, the question is whether he can convert his deal-making style into a durable peace. For Putin, the calculation is whether legitimizing his gains is worth ending a war that has cost Russia lives, resources, and international standing. As the world watches, one thing is certain: the path to peace in Ukraine now runs through Washington, Moscow, and Kyiv. What happens in the coming weeks could reshape Europe's security architecture for a generation. And so, with anticipation, with skepticism, and with no shortage of uncertainty, we wait for the next move.